Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you could join us today for our webinar on why a robust design and development process is critical for regulatory submission success. I'm Gay Esther, the marketing manager here at RegDesk. And if you don't know what we do, we're an AI-powered regulatory platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. And our platform allows regulatory teams to leverage AI so you can prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. To focus on you for a minute, we do really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be here with us today and attend the webinar. And we'd love for you to participate and ask questions. So be sure to put those in the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat if you want, and we'll save the last 5 to 10 minutes of the webinar to go over those. And also, we will share the slide deck and the recording by the end of the week, so be on the lookout for that. And if there are any unanswered questions that we aren't able to get to, we'll include those in there as well. Now, let me take a moment to introduce our esteemed expert. Today, we have the privilege of having Jodi Granger here, and she works with us at RegDesk as the Director of Regulatory Affairs. Jodi brings over 37 years of experience in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device and IVD industry. She has leadership roles in overseeing global regulatory teams and driving the development and execution of regulatory strategies for all classes of medical devices worldwide. Welcome, Jodi, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to see what you have to share and to listen to your topic today. And I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gay, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Gay said, we do appreciate it, and we hope you'll find some value out of the time that you spend with us today. As Gay mentioned, our topic is really to discuss the design and development process and why that process is really critical to run smoothly to allow regulatory professionals to have success in their submissions. So with that in mind, I'm going to walk through the history of design controls. I think this is important because, there's some likely on this call that think that design controls have always been a requirement for medical devices, but that's not the case. And I think having that history and the evolution of design control regulatory requirements is important for all of us for context purposes. I'm also going to discuss a typical design and development process flow, but then dive into the details of where does regulatory actually fit into that process and how you as regulatory professionals can really influence making sure that that design and development procedures and processes are robust. At the end, as Gay mentioned, we'll do a Q&A session to allow any questions to be answered that we have time for. You can add them to the chat as we go through, and then Gay will be able to rattle those off to me at the end. So let's dive right in. So as I mentioned, we're going to walk through the history of design controls and the design and development process. So back when medical devices were originally regulated, design controls in that context actually did not exist. Device regulation in most countries focused on product safety and performance standards, and certainly good manufacturing practices for production-related activities. Quality requirements were largely manufacturing-oriented, and there was really no explicit regulation over how a company goes about designing and developing a new product. In the US, the FDA issued the 1978 device GMP regulations, and those again were mostly focused on the manufacturing processes, installation of equipment, but design activities were not really explicit in those regulations. So the birth of formal design control processes really happened in the 90s, and this is where that term design control really comes in. It came out of the United States. So there was the Safe Medical Devices Act of 1990, and this authorized FDA to add design controls into the device GMP requirements. The QSR regulation came after that, and that was the original was in the mid 1990s, and it became effective in 1997. 21 CFR 820.30 was updated for design controls explicitly, and this started the requirement for manufacturers to implement procedures specific to the whole design control process. So that included design and development planning, how you generate your design inputs and outputs, um, having processes in place to have formal design reviews, the requirements for design verification and validation, how you do design transfer. So when you're done with the development and you want to do a design transfer into manufacturing, how is that process going to be done? How do you control changes over time? Certainly after you've marketed your device, many times there's needs for process changes, specification changes, design changes, and you need to be able to document all those changes and implement them in a controlled manner. All of that is kind of encompassed in organizations within the design history file. So that design history file is a dynamic group of documents that basically show the life cycle of your product from beginning to end. So FDA did issue a design control guidance in 1997, and that was available to manufacturers. So although US kind of kicked off that design control terminology, there was parallel evolution going on in Europe and the creation of ISO standards throughout the 90s and early 2000s. So the Europe does not use the term or the phrase design control, but they've implemented equivalent concepts through their quality management system and conformity assessment processes. The EU medical device directives were initially enacted both for active and implantable medical devices under the medical device directive as well as the IVD directive. These all require that devices meet state-of-the-art safety and performance requirements, and that you have an appropriate quality system to govern that. This did include design and development controls, and all of those are audited by notified bodies before you can obtain your certification. In terms of the ISO standards, there's critical standards that have been implemented that have a direct impact on the design and development process. There's EN 46001, EN 46002, and ISO 13485. So if you encompass the three of these standards within your organization, each of them are going to govern particular requirements related back to the design and manufacture of devices. ISO 13485, of course, was also issued, the first edition in 1996. That particular standard was very specific to medical device specific quality management system requirements. And of course, that's been edited over time. The initial release was in 1996. That evolved in 2003, and then followed by the third edition, which is in 2016. This third edition really brought in a greater focus on risk management, how you control software, control of your suppliers, and how you manage your life cycle. So all of those updates in the 2016 have a direct impact on your design and development life cycle. So it's important to understand that even though the European legislation does not specifically state design control, the elements of the legislations and these standards are essentially the same thing. They just use different terminology. In addition, there are efforts that have been ongoing since the early 90s for global harmonization. So it's very difficult, as many of you know, that if you have different requirements across the globe and you're trying to sell your product in all markets, not having harmonized requirements makes it very challenging for manufacturers. So there was an effort for global harmonization through the Global Harmonization Task Force that was founded in 1992. That's now been replaced by the IMDRF, which is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So a lot of countries participate in this forum, and they, again, try to harmonize around the requirements, including those pertaining to design and development. So these initiatives are really intended to kind of modernize how the design control framework looks, and so that you can kind of have similarities across markets and ensure that companies aren't having to do completely different things based on the countries that they choose to market their products in. From there, we've also seen additional expansion to other requirements. Software is a key area, and also risk-based design. So additional standards have come into play. ISO 14971 is for risk management of medical devices. The IEC 62304 talks about the software lifecycle processes, and then usability engineering as well. So making sure that manufacturers are looking at exactly how users will utilize their products in the clinical setting, and ensure that they're addressing those usability requirements as well. Even though it's not written in all country legislation that these standards are mandatory, they are certainly expected. Most regulators, regardless of the market, truly expect that these standards are applied and traced throughout your design history file and technical documentation. So I encourage all manufacturers to ensure that they are looking at these standards as routine requirements if your product has elements related to these areas. So in terms of modern regulatory framework, of course, the European Union went through a major overhaul and went from the Medical Device Directive to MDR and IVDR. So we're still in the process now of manufacturers kind of converting their product from the old legislation to the new. The updates required your quality management system to cover all stages of your design, manufacture, and post-market processes. They detailed technical documentation within Annex 2 and 3 that effectively serves as an expanded design history file. So it's really important that you understand those annexes and how they pertain. They also have integrated risk management, clinical evaluation, usability, PMS, and PMCF requirements as well. So all of those areas will impact your design, and certainly design changes need to look at those areas to see if you need to update your risk management. Do you need to do additional clinical studies, etc., in order to make those changes? And again, while they don't name design controls explicitly, the structure is very similar to the US model and expectations. In the US, one major change that is being made, for decades, the US enforced 21 CFR 820, and that was the explicit legal design control requirement. In 2024, FDA issued the QMSR regulation, the final rule, which is going into effect. And this is essentially incorporating the ISO 1345 used in Europe by reference to the law. So it is important now for manufacturers who maybe they didn't sell in Europe previously and they weren't looking to get ISO 1345 certification. Manufacturers now need to look at the US and say, okay, based on this being incorporated, what do we need to do? They need to do a gap assessment related to that. Other major markets have similar frameworks. As I mentioned, most large regulators now implement some kind of design control requirements. Canada has a CMDR. It requires ISO 1345 base QMS. The MDSAP program is a requirement in Canada to have an MDSAP certification in order to register your products. Australia, Japan, Brazil, all major markets really are putting similar frameworks in place. All of these will be audited as you submit your registrations. If you don't have certificates in place that each country accepts, each of the organizations can audit you independently as well. So in terms of an overall, where are we now based on that history, there's key takeaways for the global picture. Essentially, controls are globalized, meaning most of your markets are going to require some type of design control. So in law, the US has placed that in 21 CFR 820. The EU and many others embed them via the QMS requirements and the specific technical documentation needed for submissions. The release of standards certainly evolved over time, and I would expect additional standards will be added, especially as innovation occurs in the medical device space. We see that now with AI technology. A lot of regulators are now trying to put guidance documents and standards associated with AI. So in practice, all regulators, regardless of the terminology that they're using, are moving more toward a risk-based life cycle design process. So, it starts out with customer user needs so that you can create your design inputs, confirm those inputs with outputs, and verification and validation testing, all the risk controls, clinical evidence. And then a very important part of the process is after you market, all that post-market feedback that you receive needs to be assessed to determine whether design changes are required. So that's kind of the history of the design controls and how they came into play in the medical device space. So what does a typical design and development process look like? Every company does it a little differently, but essentially this flow chart is pretty standard in the industry in terms of what the process looks like. It is a multi-phased process. It usually starts out when the project is initiated. Someone has a great idea and says, oh, I think we need to, create this new device to satisfy this clinician need. So they gather the user needs, and that will also filter in with the regulatory requirements. Design planning is conducted, and ultimately that leads to your design inputs. And from there, the project will go through multiple phases where you're doing feasibility testing until you get to the point where you can do full-blown verification and validation testing. Ultimately, once all your verification and validation is completed, then you can work to move to a design transfer into the manufacturing space. And once you've commercialized the product, all of the activities, the complaints that you receive, the deviations that might be found in your production process, all of those will play into the changes that you may make over your product life cycle. So the key thing is really, where does regulatory affairs fit into this overall process? So I'm going to walk through the different elements of the design control process and what regulatory should consider. It's really important, and I think a lot of manufacturers struggle with this, especially in, smaller organizations, where regulatory needs to have a seat at the table right from the get-go. They play an absolute continuous role in the design and development process. They need to be integrated into that process from the beginning. So right from the concept through post-market. You shouldn't be trying to bring regulatory in a submission at a time. You need to look at the global strategy for where you intend to market your products. I find that a lot of companies sell globally, but they don't think globally, in that they may think that the US 510(k) submission is the priority. They just want to get that over the finish line, or they want to submit their EU technical document and get that over the finish line, but then immediately move to market their products in all other areas of the world. I've had instances where companies that did that found that they were having to redo a lot of work. And I'll give you one example. If your focus is only on the US, you just want to get that submission out the door, you're collecting your verification and validation data. You've developed a package that will accommodate an IFU that's only in English, or you've chosen, I'm going to have an EIFU only, and you've done all of your sterilization validation, your ship testing, your packaging testing with that in mind. Now, when you want to go global, you have to have all your documentation, your IFU translated into other languages. The size of that document is bigger than you had originally planned for. Not all countries accept an electronic IFU. So now they've had to go back and repeat those tests. They had to repeat their packaging validation, repeat or try to justify their sterilization validation. So it's really important to ensure that you have regulatory involvement on the front end, and that you truly act like a global company that you are. You definitely want to sell in more than the US market. So all of the design inputs need to take these things and considerations into play. So in terms of the life cycle for design and development, the first phase is usually looking at user needs and early concept. So regulatory's responsibilities in this area is to help the project team identify what the regulatory classification is going to be across your target markets. This helps you to build out your global regulatory plan. They need to help determine what your intended use and indication for use is going to be. What are the boundaries and what are the regulatory implications? If you're trying to market in the US a Class 2 product and you want to sell for a particular intended use, but you don't have a predicate device, then your regulatory pathway and strategy is going to be different. So it's really important to look at all markets that you intend to sell and ensure that you get those boundaries for your intended use and indication for use nailed down. As you know, as regulatory professionals, changes to intended use or indications for use is significant, and it may impact the clinical data that you collect. It may impact and require you to do a new submission if you modify that at a later time. The regulatory team will also identify for each market, is this actually a medical device? Is it an IVD? Does it fall into the classification for a combination product because perhaps we have a drug component on the device, like a drug-eluting stent? Is there software? And if so, does it classify as software as a medical device? So identifying for each market where your product is going to fall into these categories is very important. Not all products are considered a medical device in every single market. There are cases where um, a particular product is not classified as a medical device and therefore regulated much differently. So this assessment is really critical in these early concept phase. And regulatory should also help to flag the feasibility of the product. Is this a novel technology? If you're looking at a US market, do you have predicate devices? Is there a substantial equivalence pathway? If you don't know what clinical evidence you're going to need, then regulatory can help to vet that out for you early. And ultimately, what you want to come out is the first draft, the first revision of a global regulatory strategy. So RA intersects with design controls in this area because you need to understand the user needs and the product concept and be able to guide the organization to know, is this viable from a regulatory perspective to be able to get this product on the market? So that's the first phase of the design process. The second is in regards to design inputs. So this is where you start to get much more detail in terms of being able to assess the regulatory requirements in each of the target markets, determine what essential requirements need to be met. Are there special controls for this specific device? Are there guidance documents specific for this type of device? Are there standards, and what are those standards that you need to comply with? There are country-specific labeling rules that may need to be factored in, translations, content, etc., UDI requirements, cybersecurity expectations, etc. All of these kind of feed in as well to your risk management documentation, which you will need to have aligned with ISO 14971. So this area is where you start to get much more specific in terms of what the product is going to be required to meet. And again, I'll continue to stress that it's really important that these design inputs are thinking globally, because you don't want to have to repeat testing because you didn't factor in some requirement of a market that was on your target list, maybe not the top priority, but ultimately someplace that you want to go. So regulatory in this phase really helps to ensure that all regulatory, safety, and performance obligations are known to the team and fed into this design input phase. Next is in terms of design outputs. So regulatory will take a role in really reviewing the design outputs that start to be generated. Any product specification documents, drawings, your software architecture, etc. Each of these reviews will ensure that you factor in any regulatory constraints, that you understand what claims that you're going to be able to make on the product, what indications you're going to have, that you're going to be able to comply with specific standards. And again, you want to make sure that all of the documents that your cross-functional team are creating are aligned with the regulatory strategies that have been put into place. These all feed in to your verification and validation, which help to support your regulatory submissions. Your design reviews are going to happen at different phases in the process, and regulatory is a required participant for those formal design reviews. During those meetings, you should be reviewing from, a regulatory perspective that the documentation is complete and auditable for that phase. Normally, each phase will have a list of deliverables that are required, and you need to make sure that each of those deliverables are met. This is also the process where the team and regulatory are looking at both your inputs and your outputs and making sure that those will meet the regulatory bodies review, expectations and review. They will look at the risk benefit profile. They will finalize what applicable standards need to be met and make sure any guidance documents especially for product specific guidance documents that might be available, that those are incorporated. And finally, the clinical and labeling considerations are aligned. So during these meetings, RA is really acting as a gatekeeper, making sure that all of the design review elements for that phase are meeting the regulatory compliance milestones along the way. For design verification, your verification protocols should be reviewed by regulatory. The reason that verification protocol should be reviewed by regulatory is that most of the time, the output from those verification activities are going to feed into regulatory submissions. So you want to ensure that you've got regulatory review and input in the beginning and not after all of those reports are completed. So the verification needs to have a pathway to demonstrate conformity to all of the regulatory inputs that were generated during the design input phase. It has to ensure that the documentation will support your various submission globally. So that's the intent of having regulatory in the loop during this verification process. For design validation, this is where you'll pull in your clinical evaluation, your human factors and usability studies, any performance testing that is going to be used to support your intended use, your claims, any market-specific requirements. There's close communication between regulatory and the clinical affairs team to ensure that any clinical evaluations that are necessary to gain market clearance are planned out and executed, and that the pre and post-market clinical studies, if needed, have been defined and planned, and that the validation for real-world use conditions have been factored in. So it's important that regulatory support this effort by being in the loop on any validation activities, because they're the ones that are going to weigh in on whether those validation activities support your real-world safety and effectiveness expectations. For the design transfer, this is, where you're moving from having your design, you've completed your verification and validation piece of it, and you can move into manufacturing. So regulatory will want to confirm the final labeling and regulatory requirements that will be moved into packaging or into manufacturing. They'll want to ensure that your packaging design, your sterilization, UDI, translations, all of that has been factored in before the formal transfer to manufacturing. It must align with what has been submitted for regulatory approval. So if there's a deviation at this stage between what was submitted and approved, then an assessment will have to be made as to whether additional regulatory action is needed. Design changes, of course, can happen along the way. It can happen as you're collecting data in the early design processes, and certainly can happen post-launch after you have marketed the product. If the change is prior to you submitting to the authority, then the process for assessing those changes may be different. Ultimately, what you need to ensure is that anything that has been filed with a regulatory authority or that has been marketed, that all changes to the product from that point of view go through a robust change control review. Regulatory needs to determine the impact of all those design changes. Will it trigger a new 510(k)? Will it require a new submission as a significant change to a notified body? Do you have an impact to your risk management file? Do those risk management files need to be updated? Every single country where the product is sold must have a comprehensive impact assessment completed before that modified device can be sold there. A lot of manufacturers do really well with assessments in major markets. They take a really close look at the US, they take a really close look at the EU. And some companies don't do so well with the rest of the world. They, their regulatory process is not necessarily as robust in those areas. But from a compliance perspective, the same attention to the change in every single market where you sell is expected. And if an auditor comes in and you're telling them that you're selling your product in 50 countries, then for each of those changes, you need to make sure that you've determined a regulatory impact in all 50 of those countries. Change control may also, even if there's not a submission that's required as the impact, you need to make sure that your documentation stays aligned and that it's updated globally. So your tech doc for Europe, of course, is dynamic. So as things are changing, even if it's not something that you need to submit for approval before implementing, you need to make sure that your tech doc is up to speed and revised accordingly. So regulatory's role is to ensure that all changes allow you to your product to remain compliant across markets, and that you maintain approvals in each of those areas. In terms of the design history file and technical documentation, design history files are usually owned by R&D primarily, but regulatory plays a key role in kind of co-owning that content. The design history file and the documents contained therein are many times used as attachments or supporting evidence within your technical files, your 510(k)s, your rest of world submissions. So it's important as those design history file documents are created and modified over time that regulatory is in the loop. You need to make sure that each of those documents are complete, that they're traceable back to the source information, that they are audit ready, and that they're maintained through the design changes. So every time your notified body comes in, they're certainly going to look at your design history file for a particular product, and they're going to walk through any changes that have occurred since the last time they reviewed. If a document is going to be used to support a regulatory filing, then it's really critical that regulatory be in the review and approval loop for these documents. This is another area where some companies get it wrong. They don't include regulatory, and then regulatory goes to do their work, to do their submissions, and find that the documentation is not adequate, or it does not meet the specifications that fall within the regulatory strategy that was built. So it's best if you ensure regulatory is in the process for reviewing those on the front end. You don't want to have to go back after you've done a shelf life study, as an example, and you've waited months to collect that data to find that the protocol was lacking in some way, and you now don't have adequate data that will satisfy a regulatory authority. So I encourage manufacturers to ensure that any document that's going to be needed to support a regulatory filing, that RA is a required reviewer and approval signature. So during this, of course, regulatory is going to just help ensure that everything is in place and ready for audit when the DHF is looked at by regulatory authorities. The post-market feedback loop is also very critical, especially now with EU MDR. There's a lot of additional requirements post-market that have come into play as medical device regulation has evolved. It's important that the feedback that you're getting on complaints, CAPAs, any adverse events, any design changes or updates, that those are fed back in through the process and assessed by regulatory. You need to ensure alignment at all times with your EU post-market surveillance plans. Sometimes you will have requirements from FDA for post-market as well. And in some countries, your global vigilance rules are going to change country to country. Some of these areas are handled by other departments. Most companies have a separate complaint department. They may even have a separate post-market surveillance department. But ultimately, regulatory needs to be in the loop on these updates and changes so that regulatory impact assessments can be made. In addition, regulations also change over time, and that can happen post-market. So if something is modified that changes the requirement in a particular market, or even changes the classification of a particular device, then regulatory is going to have to do those assessments and complete the regulatory action accordingly. So common pitfalls in the design and development process that impact regulatory outcomes. There are many common pitfalls that happen, and I've just listed a few in this table that'll be provided out. The first is incomplete user needs. So not having a clear understanding of what the customers, ultimately the clinicians, are going to need can result in unclear design inputs or usability deficiencies. So as an example, if you have a product that's packaged in a Tyvek pouch, and the way you open that pouch causes the product to pop out and go outside the sterile field, that's a user requirement. If you missed it, you could fail during your your user assessment, usability testing. Weak design inputs can result in verification failures. You might be missing a GSPR requirement or essential requirement, in that would have you go back and potentially have to repeat some verification and validation activities. Poor risk management. If you have not factored in all the requirements of ISO 14971, then regulators can certainly ask questions related to that and cause a delay in approvals. If you have weak verification mapping, meaning that you're testing, it's not very clear how you got from your design inputs to your outputs, and shown that you have evidence that you meet each of those, then that again will be questioned by regulators when you're audited. Inadequate validation. Clinical and performance deficiencies are the impact of that. If you have poor traceability, as I mentioned, if you can't trace the rationale of your inputs to your outputs through your validation, then you could have regulatory findings associated with that. Design changes over time. If you have made changes to your design and then not adequately assessed the regulatory impact, but also the impact on any testing that was done previously. Do you need to repeat certain testing? Then those certainly will get you into trouble when a regulator finds it. Software documentation. If your product does contain software, you'll need to worry about cybersecurity and IEC 62304 requirements. Not meeting all of them will cause delays in the review process or rejection or non-approval of your device. Late standards integration. Again, you need to identify the standards that you're going to need to meet at the front end before you've done your testing. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and repeat that testing, which can be very costly and time consuming. Let's see, supplier control issues. If you have particular components that are critical to your process and you do not have a process in place to control your suppliers, you could have issues in that regard. Any late documentation, DHF gaps, 43 observations will be a result. So if your process says that you need to close a kappa as an example in a particular time frame and you haven't done that, then you can have 43 observations. And ultimately, weak regulatory planning. So if you have not mapped out your pathway for all markets you intend to sell the product in, then that can be an issue. If you've misclassified or misdocumented the deliverables that are going to be needed to support a particular submission, then all of those can result in delays in getting approval. So the biggest takeaway of everything that I've gone through today is really that your design and development process needs to have regulatory involved early, and they need to be kept involved throughout the entire process. They are integral to the whole success of your design and development efforts. And certainly without their involvement, you're going to put at risk the ability to get your products on the market. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're now be able to answer any questions that have been submitted throughout the webinar. So
All right,
thank you.
perfect. Thanks, Jodi. I appreciate all of that information, and I'm sure everyone else did. And hopefully that helps everybody with preparation for submissions and making sure they have that robust design and development process in place. For our first question, the example is, for the example you cited for US versus global tech documents, is it not a viable option to get the IFU, sterilization studies, etc., translated versus redoing the study in a different language?
Yeah, the critical thing there is not was the document translated when you did your study. It really goes more into, is the dimensions of the document going to change that could impact the study? So if you have an instructions for use that is in English, maybe it's 1 page or 2 pages. Now you're going to Europe and you've got to add 20 plus languages. And so your document is now 20 plus pages. It's thicker, it's bigger, it's bulkier. So all of the testing that you did with that 1 pager may not apply. It's possible that a larger IFU in the box is going to cause you to have pouch holes because the product is compressed and packed too tight. it's possible that it takes more effort to sterilize the product because you've got this bulk in there. So that is really more the point I was trying to make, is that the whatever you're having to modify, whether it be the size of an IFU or the size of your package, etc., all of that has to be assessed in terms of what testing did we do, and do I now have to repeat it?
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for the clarification on that. Another question is, what happens if I outsource design activities? How do I ensure that I adhere to my D&D process? And then do I conduct design reviews with the service provider? And I can break those down into separate things so you can answer one at a time, maybe. So what happens if I outsource design activities?
You can certainly outsource design activities. The critical thing is to determine roles and responsibilities. Are you going to be considered the owner of the design? And if so, there are requirements that you have to meet, and because you are ultimately responsible for the design. Many companies outsource development, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, but those roles and responsibilities are critical in terms of what you're required to do and not.
Okay, and then how do they ensure that they adhere to their D&D process?
Yeah, I think first of all, you have to determine is the development process going to be managed by that external party, or are they just feeding into you as the ultimate design owner, the requirements? So, you know, and I'll say that it can be broken down even by the elements of the process. You just have to make it very clear who owns what, document that, and ensure that you have control of it over time.
Okay, and if they do use somebody else, should they conduct design reviews with that service provider, like for each of those steps they break down, or how should they do that?
Design reviews need, if it were me, I would certainly want to do that, because how do you know that they're progressing along a path that's going to ultimately meet your requirements if you're not involved in those design review meetings? But if for some reason you opt out of that, then you're basically giving ownership of that process to your third party.
Okay, and we have a few more questions, so hopefully we can get to those before the end. How early should regulatory affairs be involved in the design and development process? And what are the risks when RA is pulled in too late?
Yeah, this we touched on a little bit. Absolutely in the beginning. They need to be there even at that concept phase so that they can help guide the organization on what is feasible from a regulatory perspective. You know, just because there's a great idea doesn't mean that there is a viable pathway for approval. So it's important that they're involved early on. It's important that they understand what the target markets are so that they can help guide you in those early steps.
Okay, and then just a couple more. We'll see if we can get through the last few. What are the most common gaps regulators find in design history files or technical documentation, and how can teams avoid those?
Yeah, one of the most common, I think, is really tracing your user requirements to your design inputs to your design outputs. Having that clearly delineated in your design history file will save you a lot of trouble. You can just map it out so it's very clear, how one leads to the other and what supporting evidence you have that you've now, met that design input.
Okay, and then we'll try to get through the last two. How do global regulatory differences, such as US QMSR, shift to ISO 13485 and EU MDR, and what the impact of those, and how do companies structure their design control activities?
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory environment is constantly evolving. That's one reason why I walked through the history early in this presentation. And one of the key roles of regulatory is to monitor those changes over time. You need to be triggered when things are being looked at in various countries. A lot of times, they'll be putting out draft information before it becomes a requirement. So it's important that as those regulation changes are being proposed and that the regulatory team is helping you determine for your organization, what does that mean to us? What are we going to have to do differently? And you can get a plan in place to ensure that you have that new structure or that new requirement reflected before it becomes obligatory.
Okay. Another one is, what role does risk management, for example, ISO 14971, play in shaping design inputs, verification, validation, and post-market updates?
Yeah, I mean, risk management, we can do a whole webinar just on that area, but certainly more and more regulators are looking at the risk profile as the critical element in terms of your design inputs. You need to make sure that the risks, safety, usability, et cetera, are all addressed as part of your process and your design inputs. You want to make sure that all risks are minimized as much as possible so that your product can meet its intended purpose and that it's safe and effective for customers or doctors to use on patients.
Okay, and then we have one more question that came in. How can companies ensure that design changes after commercialization remain globally compliant, especially given varying rules? For example, EU significant changes or FDA 510(k) changes.
Yeah, every single market that you sell in, you need to do an assessment. Every single country. And you need to document that assessment for every single country. There are some regulators that provide wonderful guidance documents. They provide decision trees to help walk you through the process if you're making a particular change, what kind of impact that has on your existing submissions. There are other markets that aren't that sophisticated, and you need to be able to, make those assessments based on the data available to you. Whatever assessment you do, make sure it's thoroughly documented. So when auditors come in, even if they disagree with your finding, they at least understand how you got to that decision and that you weren't just completely ignoring doing the assessment in the first place.
Okay, perfect. That answered everybody's questions that sent in so far. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to submit them to us, and we'll be happy to try to go through those and answer any of those as well. And as a reminder, we will send out the slide deck and the recording, so be on the lookout for that by the end of the week. And then we also have an upcoming webinar for December 2025. It'll be our last webinar of the year, and we will go over global regulatory roundups from our key markets, and we'll show you lots of different updates and regulations that happened in 25 and get you prepped for 2026. So be on the lookout for that to sign up and register. And we hope you've enjoyed this one. Thank you again, Jodi. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Y'all have a great day.